Hello, 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 and kia ora to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we are venturing to New Zealand, the land of kiwi birds and Lord of the Rings and Flight of the Conchords in no particular order. I'm excited and nervous for this series because I don't know that much about New Zealand. I know that it occasionally gets omitted off of world maps, and that's not great. I know the last prime minister was Jacinda Ardern. I know it's a beautiful country and they make really great Pinot Noir. But other than that, I really have a lot to learn. So I'm excited to be learning along with you for this series. Just a blanket warning for anyone listening in New Zealand that I will do my best to pronounce local names and phrases correctly. But if, or probably more likely when, I mess them up, please feel free to correct me, as I'm starting from basically no previous knowledge. And I also don't want to say them incorrectly throughout the series. And sort of to that point, I have a bit of a longer and more serious introduction to this series than I generally offer. So if you're new to the show, I usually jump right in, but I think this disclaimer is really important to give. It speaks to how much I have to learn, not only about different places and events happening around the world, but how I approach the retelling of the histories of these old hospitals. So when I was thinking of which hospital to cover next, I had thought back to how much fun the series on Ararat and the hospitals in Victoria were. So I thought I'd just choose a hospital in that general neck of the woods. New Zealand, I thought. That would be fun to learn about. Google search, click. Seacliff Lunatic Asylum, perfect, click. And as I generally do when I start a series, I join various Facebook groups in the area around the hospital I'll be covering. I try to get volunteers to share stories about the hospital if they're willing. And generally I get responses like, my grandmother was hospitalized there. I don't know very much about it. Or my aunt was a nurse there and she has really horrifying stories. And I really appreciate those responses because they help me get to know the perspective that many folks in the area have about the hospital. When I joined the groups near Dunedin and Seacliff, I got some of these usual responses, which was great. But I also realized that I had inadvertently stepped into a fairly precarious situation that I would either need to back away from completely or tiptoe into very gently. And that's part of the reason why I took an extra week to release this episode. So unbeknownst to me, there's currently a lot of discussion about the horrific patient abuse that took place at psychiatric hospitals around New Zealand during the latter half of the 20th century. It's so recent a conversation that recommendations were released at the end of this May in 2024, and the final report of the years-long inquiry into the abuse will be released at the end of this month in June 2024. So what information has been released so far has understandably stirred up a lot of contention that I feel inadequate and maybe inappropriate for me to address. So that said, I do want to follow what's happening in New Zealand in regard to this inquiry, and I'd like to keep you all posted on what's being unveiled. It's really important to me that we look our past right in the face and see it for what it was, the good and the bad, and try to move forward and do better. So that said, I will be looking at this inquiry, the report, the community response as an outsider. So it's highly likely that I will make unintentional missteps along the way. I will defer to locals with more knowledge and experience to provide interpretations if they so choose. This is also a good place to remind all my listeners that I'm not an expert on these hospitals, nor am I claiming to be. I try to get a good sense from folks in the area about the hospitals before I dive into my research, but I will do my best to give you the most accurate information I can access. In regard to Seacliff, there's plenty more local information that I probably will not be able to share because it's in print copy in the town of Dunedin, all the way across the world from me. So bear with me, I'll do the best that I can. That said, a very huge thank you to everyone in the Dunedin area Facebook groups who gave me ideas for resources I could access, but an extra big thank you to Sue M for going above and beyond to help me access a book I otherwise could not have used. Thank you so much. Thank you also to Jay for cultural assistance. I am just so grateful and humbled for the help I got, and I hope I can do justice to the story of this hospital and to your hometown. My main sources for this episode will be select essays from an anthology called Unfortunate Folk, Essays on Mental Health Treatment, 1863 to 1992, edited by Barbara Brookes and James Thomson, as well as The History of Seacliff by Frank Tod. All other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. The main trigger warning for this episode is the use of outdated and ableist language that was typical for the time period I'm addressing. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Seacliff Mental Hospital. As with most of our hospital series, the story of Seacliff Mental Hospital begins long before the construction began in 1878. We have to go back to the 1840s. New Zealand had been annexed by Great Britain in 1840, so they were still living under British rule. And if you remember all the way back to episode 30, which was the first episode on Denbigh Asylum in Wales, you might remember that Britain at this time was functioning under the County Asylums Act of 1828. This offered more money to counties in the area to build small asylums in lieu of poorhouses. Even by 1844, this had not trickled down to New Zealand yet, as the earliest homes for lunatics, quote unquote, were wooden buildings attached to the Wellington and Auckland jails. Lunatics received no treatment. They were simply watched to keep them from harming themselves or others. But jails were used to hold drunkards, unhoused folks, and people who had unpaid debts. So jailers really wanted to find a way to relocate the lunatics to mitigate overcrowding. By the way, I often get questioned about the use of lunatic and lunatic asylum in these episodes. Please note that these are not the terms I would use to describe folks with mental illness. These were the actual terms used during this time period. So generally, a term is unless a term is overtly offensive because it's been connected to systemic oppression, I'll use the terms that the government and or medical providers used at the time, just as a way to show the progress of thinking since that time. Language is continually evolving, so there may be terms that we use today that we change in the future or learn are problematic. In Great Britain, the Lunacy Act of 1845 stipulated that every asylum had to be registered with the Lunacy Commission, had to have a written set of regulations, and needed a resident physician to oversee the facility. New Zealand followed suit in 1846 with the creation of the Lunatics Ordinance, which declared that after certification by 2 doctors and a magistrate, a lunatic could be held in a jail or prison or in a public hospital or asylum. Obviously, there seems to be a lot of gray area here and room for bias. Regardless of where the person would be sent, they wouldn't receive any type of treatment for their mental illness. That was the catch. But this precedent of 1846 seemed to highlight the need for a dedicated psychiatric facility. The first asylum in New Zealand opened in 1854. That was the Karori Lunatic Asylum near Wellington. This was followed by the Littleburn Lunatic Asylum in Dunedin in 1863, and the Sunnyside Lunatic Asylum in Christchurch, also in 1863. In 1867, the Faux Lunatic Asylum opened in Auckland. In 1872, Seaview Lunatic Asylum opened in Hokitika. This is Seaview, not to be confused with Seacliff, just as a heads up. In 1876, Nelson Lunatic Asylum opened on the northern tip of the South Island. So by the mid-1870s, 6 asylums had opened within 20 years. And you may be wondering, why? The reason will sound familiar if you've listened to the episodes on either Airedale or Napa. In May of 1861, settlers found gold in the Otago region of the South Island. And you know what that means. Gold rush. The native Maori people, of course, had known that there was gold, but it wasn't useful for them, so they'd left it alone. But the Europeans immediately began panning for gold in the area. And as it had in Victoria and California, the Otago Gold Rush drew people from around the world. By 1864, there were 18,000 miners in the area. And you may remember from our series on Airedale that mining for gold was hard and lonely work. It was dangerous work. And people who had immigrated to the area had particularly bad issues because most of their dreams of striking it rich weren't realized. The same thing happened in Otago. One of the consequences of the Otago Gold Rush was the emergence of Dunedin as a major hub of the region. The population grew correspondingly, as did the instances of insanity, most likely the result of the harsh working conditions and culture shock and loneliness for the new immigrants to the area. In the almost 20 years that had passed since the Lunatic Ordinance of 1846 was written, so much had changed in New Zealand. The gold rush had taken over the South Island, and 6 asylums had been built. It was already time for a little reform. As Sasha Feiner, an anthropology scholar, says, quote, "It quickly became clear that with the rise of these new institutions, the lunatic ordinance was no longer extensive enough to stand alone as the only piece of legislation regulating treatment of the insane. While the ordinance had precedented the establishment of asylums in New Zealand, it predated even any plans for the formulation of any such institution. It had consequently become rapidly outdated with the rise of the asylum as the primary facility for confining the insane." And quick interruption here to remind you that the 1846 ordinance said that lunatics could be ordered to jail, prison, public hospital, or asylum, the latter of which had not been built yet. Anyway, it was for this reason in 1868, the Lunatics Act was passed, a piece of legislation that dictated not only proper treatment of lunatics, but the management of the asylums built to keep them. The Lunatics Act required, amongst other things, that a governor-appointed inspector from each district regularly conduct inspections of the asylum within their district. There was no upper limit of visits specified, but only that they must occur at a minimum of once every 3 months, end quote. Feiner goes on to say that the visits had to be given randomly without prior notice, and the findings recorded in detail. This came as a result of finding that an asylum in Jamaica had been able to go for lengthy periods of time, actively abusing patients without accountability. And New Zealand was determined not to follow suit. However, by 1871, an inquest had been ordered by the Joint Parliamentary Committee into New Zealand's existing lunatic asylums. According to Warwick Brunton, asylums in and around the goldfields, which happened to have the most wealth, were more likely to meet standards, whereas asylums in less affluent areas tended to lag behind. After their inquest, the committee, quote, "called for the improvement in all asylums and looked to the general government to make proper provision for lunatics through the appointment of a specialist psychiatrist who would supervise and control all lunatic asylums." The Joint Committee also recommended that more information be obtained before a decision was made about whether or not to proceed with a central asylum for the colony, end quote. Ultimately, the proposition of a central asylum was rejected, probably for the best, but the idea of a specialized national inspectorate was supported. By July 1876, the first inspector, Dr. Frederick Skye, was appointed as the head of the Lunatic Asylums Department. Sasha Feiner points out that moving lunatics from jails to asylums didn't necessarily result in improving mental health treatment. She notes that manual labor was a common component of treatment. And she adds, quote, "The patients led lives of rigid routine within the walls of the asylum. The enforcement of the strict schedules was the method of separating and confining patients day to day in a less forceful but more insidious way than locking them away in a padded room, but still utilized specific elements of the built environment of the asylum. Patients were taken out and walked twice a day when weather permitted in the airing courts, small courtyards which were contained behind the building's wings and hidden from public view. For want of a proper enclosure and to keep them from public view, patients were not often taken out into the grounds proper to walk. The dining hall saw meals served 3 times a day, carefully timetabled and distributed. For example, in the summer months, patients had breakfast at 8 in the morning, eating dinner at 1 in the afternoon, and supper at 6 o'clock. Each patient was allowed half a pound of bread with 1 pint of tea, while dinner was a pint of meat and vegetable soup with meat and potatoes and another half pound of bread." End quote. So all this to say that there was still no specific mental health treatment in the new asylums, but at least they had a safe place to go. All while this was going on, there was chatter in the background about adding a new and larger asylum in New Zealand. But where? It would have to be somewhere where there was sufficient money and personnel to fund and staff a new asylum. There were several sites considered. According to Frank Tod, they were a, quote, high tableland in the Wakari district overlooking the city, harbor, and ocean. A site at Tokomeriro was also considered, but the existence of the Seacliff Reserve settled the matter, and a working party of 14 men was sent to Seacliff in August 1898, end quote. Tod goes on to describe the story of the men entering this dense bush, climbing over fallen trees, and getting tangled in all sorts of brush. 3 hours go by like this, and they finally leave the forest, sweaty and out of breath, only to find that they've only gone about 30 yards. So that was the level of dense forest and brush they decided to choose for their new asylum. The site was located at Brens Point, north of Port Chalmers. The site would be south of the town of Dunedin, so it would have sufficient wealth and personnel for the new asylum. The problem was the actual grounds itself. The plot of land that had been chosen had soil comprised of bentonite clay. And you may be familiar with bentonite clay. I used it during my I'm going to make all my own health products phase. It's sort of it's a soft and natural sunscreen, pending that it doesn't have any heavy metals infused in it. Well, that's beside the point. The problem is that bentonite clay isn't anything you want to build on, but surveyors in 1875 wouldn't have known that. They had been warned by local Maori folks not to build on the site, but they didn't listen. And I just have to say, if local people who know the land and have lived there for thousands of years say not to build on the site, you probably shouldn't build on the site. But I digress. And it wasn't just the Maori people who had problems with the location of the site. Quite a few people worried about the stability of the grounds. Nonetheless, construction began in 1878. The first building was called the Upper Building, or D Ward, since it was built above where the main building was planned to be built. D Ward had accommodation for 60 male patients along with their attendants. Another wooden building was built for 60 more men. And remember that it's patients who are doing much of the construction work here. Tod points out, quote, "The patients and staff who arrived at Seacliff in the late 1870s worked under extremely trying conditions. The bush had to be felled and the trees and scrub removed, roads made, water courses formed, and the ground grubbed. As no metal was available, the grounds around the buildings were like a quagmire, and for some years the only access from the hospital to the unmetalled and barely passable Evansdale-Brins Point Road was a corduroy path formed of rough logs. Provisions were sent out weekly from the Dunedin Asylum by horse and dray. In those long days, a long, arduous journey," end quote. So imagine for a moment that you are one of those people doing all of this backbreaking work in less than ideal conditions. And then you start hearing whispers that maybe the asylum shouldn't be built on this land after all. I know I would wonder if I were doing all that work for nothing. One of the first concerns about the land came from the Inspector General of Mental Hospitals in his 1879 report. Quote, "The site on which the temporary building has been placed has unfortunately not proved so good as it seemed. Great trouble has been caused by the continual slipping downward of a bank in the rear of its north wing, which has at last got seriously injured, the concrete walls on which it rests, having been partially pushed from underneath it. The engineer in charge is causing a series of deep drains to be made so as to stop further slipping, and piles are being substituted for damaged concrete. It appears that over a large area in this district, the ground frequently turns out to be of the same treacherous nature as this piece, which has given such a disagreeable warning." End quote. The recommendation was to slightly alter the placement of the north wing of the main building so that the foundation would be safe and stable. Another survey suggested that they move the building to another location on the property altogether. The director of Geological Survey, Dr. James Hector, gave a full report on this finding, that the new location for the asylum was undesirable. He even worried that the plan to build a tall tower in the central structure could weigh too much to be built safely. His recommendation was to alter the plans so the entire structure could be more secure and not to erect the tower unless absolutely necessary. The architect, R.A. Lawson, ultimately rejected some of the recommendations, stating that he had done his due diligence in selecting the areas to build. The tower, he said, was not just for aesthetic value, but it would also serve as a watchtower to prevent patients from escaping. He stated he would not be completing new plans, but would consider other recommendations from Dr. Hector. There were no more, so construction of the main asylum began in 1878. Now, a quick word about the architect, Robert Arthur Lawson. He was a renowned architect in the area, known for designing most of the new construction in and around Dunedin in the Victorian style. He designed over 40 churches, as well as Larnac Castle and the Otago Boys High School. He was known for his use of Gothic revival and classical styles of architecture. So it really was no surprise that Lawson would be chosen as the designer of the new asylum in Seacliff. He had been working on his plans for the asylum long before the site was even chosen. It would be his most elaborate project to date, built in the Scottish baronial style. According to the Seacliff Lunatic Asylum Wikipedia page, quote, "Lawson's work on the asylum was very exuberant, making some of his previous designs look comparatively tame. The asylum had turrets on corbels projecting from nearly every corner, with a gabled roof line dominated by a large tower complete with further turrets and a spire. The building contained 4.5 million bricks made of local clay on the site and was 225 meters long by 67 meters wide, about 738 feet by 219 feet. The Great Central Tower was 50 meters height, or 164 feet. An essential element of many revivalist designs was also proposed to double as an observation tower if inmates should try to escape," end quote. By the time the asylum would be completed, it would be the largest and most elaborate building in all of New Zealand, and it would stay the largest building in New Zealand for 50 years. The main building would be able to accommodate 500 patients and a staff of 50. According to Tod, quote, 4.5 million bricks were made on the site with a Craven's patent pressing machine. The bricks were pressed separately, and about 10 tons pressure was applied to each brick. Many bricks were rejected because they contained lime, but it was estimated that just over 4 million bricks were used in the main building. The gravel for cement was taken from the Shag River. Oamaru stone was used for the gables, and the roof was of Welsh slates. Most of the staircases were made of bluestone or granite. A railway track was constructed from the old railway station site to the asylum to transport building materials, the wagons being drawn by horses, end quote. There was a strong push to alleviate the overcrowding in nearby asylums, especially the one in Dunedin, so Seacliff Lunatic Asylum opened before construction was even finished, despite public outcry. Everyone seemed to be concerned about the location of the new facility, but the team decided to press onward. In 1881, Dr. A.H. Neal became the first medical superintendent of Seacliff Lunatic Asylum. He had previously worked at the Wellington Asylum, so he came with experience. When Dr. Neal was appointed, the asylum's population was divided between Dunedin and Seacliff. Dr. Neal facilitated the final transfer of patients from Dunedin to Seacliff. But the same concerns kept returning. In 1882, long before construction was complete, the Inspector General of Asylums declared that Seacliff had been, quote, badly designed and out of date, end quote. It's never a good sign when your building is said to be poorly designed and out of date before it's even completed. By the following year, 1883, more problems in the main building had appeared. Quote, the woodwork and fittings of the window and doors throughout the establishment showed evidence of bad material and even worse workmanship. Quick interruption to say that maybe they shouldn't have had patients doing much of the construction, but I digress. Anyway, grave anxiety was expressed as early as 1883 over continual movement of the foundation in the north wing. Plaster was constantly falling and alarming noises were heard in the timbers of the roof. It had been suggested that if the site was about 5 chains further south to the one chosen, the risk of landslips would be greatly eliminated, end quote. But yet again, they pressed on. Most patients continued clearing brush in order to make room for a vegetable garden and the eventual farm. A shoemaker's shop was established to make and repair shoes for patients at both the Dunedin and Seacliff asylums. Work was the primary form of treatment at the time. Construction of the main building was finally completed in 1884, 5 years after it began. By 1886, the Inspector General of Asylums described Seacliff as, quote, inexpressively dreary and dispiriting, end quote. That would make for a terrible Yelp review. And I just want to rewind a bit to 1882. This was the year that New Zealand passed the Lunatics Act of 1882, and this legislation was significant for several reasons. Up to this point, and this is true in other areas of the world at the time as well, lunatic as a term was defined broadly. It included people with severe mental illness, of course, but it also included folks with developmental disabilities, certain physical disabilities or limitations, alcoholics, and poor and unhoused people. Problem was, those folks, many of whom were, or still are today, considered very vulnerable, were mixed in with people who'd committed serious crimes as a result of their state of mind. The Lunatics Act of 1882 effectively worked to separate people who had committed crimes from those who had not. It also further subdivided the criminally insane into 2 categories. The first group, the act called, quote, lunatic prisoners. These were folks who had committed a crime and appeared to be insane while they were in jail or prison, so not necessarily at the time of their offense. The act indicated that people who started to show symptoms while incarcerated could be removed and sent to the asylum, pending that they had the certification of 2 medical practitioners. If and when the lunatic prisoner had regained their sanity, they would either be returned to prison or discharged directly from the asylum. The second group was called, quote, criminal lunatics, which fell under the lunatics charged with indictable offenses section of the act. These were folks who could be discharged or acquitted of a crime by a court on the grounds of insanity and were detained in an asylum. So this is essentially the same process as our not guilty by reason of insanity defense today. Separating these folks from those who had not committed an offense would be a conversation that administrators would return to again and again. They were limited in where they could house the criminally insane. They weren't suitable for prison, yet somewhere like Seacliff might be inappropriate for them because of the more lax and treatment-focused environment. And I'll come back to this in upcoming episodes. For now, let's go back to life in Seacliff in 1885. Attendants were paid £80 per year, which is the equivalent of a little over £13,000 or about 17,000 US dollars today. There was a cottage for single staff at the rear of the main building. Married men were given an allowance for travel. I'm not sure what married women were expected to do if they got their own cottage or if they got an allowance as well. 1887 brought change to the asylum. Superintendent Neal was replaced by Dr. Radford King as superintendent of Seacliff. Sadly, Dr. King was not in good health, so he didn't stay long at the asylum before he had to leave his post and return to Auckland before eventually returning to England. And then the inevitable happened. The grounds that everyone had been so concerned about started to give way under part of the North Wing. As Frank Tod says, quote, all female patients were evacuated from the Northern Wing, and the building was in such a dangerous condition that plans were underway for the demolition of this part of the main building. It was replaced later by wooden buildings. A Royal Commission of Inquiry was set up in 1888. It was extremely critical of the architect and builder, referring to the absence of good drainage, the want of sufficiently broad and deep footings, the absence of cross ties, and the weak construction of the walls generally. End quote. Dr. Hector, the geologist who gave his recommendations during the first survey, reasserted what he had initially warned architect Robert Lawson about. The ground underneath the construction site did not have sufficient drainage, and Dr. Hector placed full blame for this on Robert Lawson, seeing that he waited 30 months to get a response from the Public Works Department about the drainage situation. The letter from Dr. Hector ended with a brutal admonition of the construction. Quote, without going so far as to say the materials and workmanship now in the works are absolutely bad or utterly defective, the commissioners are clearly of the opinion that they are not of the quality or description warranted by the magnitude and importance of the building, nor are they in conformity with the spirit of the specification, especially of the general conditions, which provide that the materials are to be of the very best of their respective kind, and the works executed in the very best, most substantial and workmanlike manner. Whereas it is shown by the evidence of the inspector that he was in constant contention with the contractor as to the proper execution of the work, the method of executing the contract, the quality of the bricks, and many other matters. And he distinctly says that he never was satisfied with the manner in which the contract was performed, and that he considered the latter part of the work, which included the North Wing, to be executed in an inferior manner to the first part, end quote. So all that to say, hey, we gave you recommendations that you didn't follow. You fought us every step of the way. We said the North Wing was going to have problems unless you took our recommendations, but you didn't. And look, now it's had problems. The fallout from this debacle ruined Robert Lawson's reputation as an architect. He basically fled to Melbourne, Australia following the incident and remained there for 10 years. He would eventually return to New Zealand in an attempt to reclaim his good name, but he died unexpectedly 2 years after his return. A century after his death, Robert Lawson's good reputation was finally reestablished when the glories of Victorian architecture began again to be recognized and appreciated. And that's where I'm going to pause the history of Seacliff Lunatic Asylum for this week. I know we didn't get too far into the history, but the setup and the whole debate about the construction is a large part of the history of the facility, so I thought it was important to tell. I also wanted to wait to introduce one of the main characters of the Seacliff legacy, Sir Truby King. Folks from New Zealand, especially those from around the Dunedin area, will likely recognize this name. But for everyone else who isn't familiar with Sir Truby King, that will be saved for next week. This guy's legacy deserves its own episode. So once again, thank you so much to everybody from the Dunedin and Seacliff Facebook pages who helped point me towards resources for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any feedback or additional information you think would be important for me to share, send me an email at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. If you like the episode, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you are listening, but especially if that's on Apple Podcasts. Every rating and review helps the algorithm find new listeners, so you do me a really big favor by rating and reviewing. And plus, I just love reading what you think of the show. If you're new, I encourage you to check out our Beacons page and Patreon page. The Patreon page is under construction, but you can get signed up for email newsletters and be the first to know when new content comes out. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you come back next week and we can learn more together. So for now, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallop. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.